On to our first of the crown eukaryotic kingdoms. Uh, the so what makes a plant a plant? Well, we know that the plants represent a monophyletic, holophyletic lineage derived from the Cheirophyta, which is one lineage of green algae. And plants are truly multicellular with different types of tissues, and in the higher plants, tissue systems. They are terrestrial, although some have evolved back into freshwater and, in rare cases, marine environments. They are photoautotrophic, meaning they can photosynthesize and fix carbon. Usually, they're size. They have cell walls made up of cellulose. They move only by growth or by hitching a ride on the wind, but they do not have the power of locomotion. They have the embryo, which is derived from the zygote, protected within gametophyte tissue, and that's why we call them sometimes the embryophyta. These are plants where the embryo is protected. And all plants exhibit sporic meiosis, or alternation of generations. So they have both a diploid individual that is multicellular and a haploid individual that is multicellular. So alternation of generations, as I just said, means we've got a haploid individual, which we call a gametophyte, or a gamete-producing plant. That's what gametophyte means. And a sporophyte, or a spore-producing plant, which is diploid. So meiosis is the process that makes diploid cells haploid. And in the case of alternation of generations, the cells produced by meiosis turn into spores. Spores then divide by mitosis to form a gametophyte, a multicellular plant. The plant, that is the gametophyte, can then go on to produce gametes by mitosis, so very different from you and I. The gametes can fuse to achieve fertilization, which gives us our first diploid cell, the zygote. And that zygote, that diploid cell, can divide to form our sporophyte, which is the diploid organism. Okay, so alternation of generations means we've got a haploid phase and a diploid phase, called the gametophyte and the sporophyte. So as far as plant diversity is concerned, we've got four major groups of plants in the kingdom. We've got non-vascular plants, sometimes called bryophytes, of which there are 3 phyla. There are seedless vascular plants, of which, well, I'm going to tell you there are 4 phyla, but some people consider that there are 2. The gymnosperms are naked seed plants, and there are 4 phyla of gymnosperms that are currently around that you can find. And then there are the covered seed plants, or the flowering plants, which are in one very large phylum that we sometimes call the angiosperms. So here is a hypothesized phylogeny, or evolutionary history, of the kingdom of plants. So you can see they're all derived from an ancestral green alga and the Cheirophyta, as I said. In order to conquer land, they had to have adaptations for living in a relatively dry habitat, not being constantly surrounded by water. But still very much dependent on liquid water. We have the liverworts, the mosses, and the hornworts, which are non-vascular plants, the bryophytes. And then we see next great innovation in plant development was the origin of vascular tissue, which meant a lot of other changes in these plants. And so we get things like the lycophytes, and what our text calls the monilophytes, which are what I'm going to tell you are 3 different phyla of plants. And then we finally get seeds in our plants, which gives us our conifers and other gymnosperms and our daffodils and other flowering plants that are our angiosperms. And here you can see the relative scale of things. So 500 million years ago, that's much earlier than the dinosaurs by about a couple of 100 million years. And then seed plants developing sometime in the middle of the Mesozoic, or the age of dinosaurs, and then angiosperms really coming into their own since the extinction of the dinosaurs. So bryophytes is a generic term to describe non-vascular plants. We have one phylum that is called the Bryophyta, with a capital B, but bryophytes, meaning non-vascular plants, is sort of a lowercase b bryophytes. So you have 3 still living phyla, or extant phyla. One thing that characterizes all of our bryophytes is that the gametophyte is the dominant generation. That's the thing that we see most of the time and that we think of as being the plant. And as far as we know, these have always been relatively small plants. Don't get very high off the ground. They don't have vascular tissue to conduct water, which makes it very difficult for them to get to be very large. And they require water for sperm dispersal. So this means they often live in moist habitats. You can find them in places where there is a lot of moisture, but some of them are very well adapted for drying out and living in a relatively dormant state for a long period of time until such a point that water becomes available. So these are our 3 phyla of bryophytes. As I said, the Bryophyta are the true mosses. Are there false mosses? Well, there are things that are called mosses that aren't really mosses, like Spanish moss that you see a little bit further south than here. It's not really a moss. And Irish moss is actually a brown alga. And there are other things that are called mosses that are not really mosses, but the true mosses are in this phylum Bryophyta. The Hepatophyta are the liverworts. You can remember that they're the liverworts because hepatitis is a disease, it means literally inflammation of the liver. So the hepatic artery feeds the liver, and so these are liverworts. Worts is an Old English word that means plants or herbs. And then our third phylum is the Anthocerophyta, or the hornworts. And this name, antho means flower, cero means horn, like a rhinoceros, or keratin is the stuff that makes up horns and scales and feathers, for that matter. So these are plants that have a horn-like sporophyte, which is where they get that name. So I'm going to cover them in reverse order, just because, reasons. Main reason being that I'm trying to draw the connection between the green alga ancestor and the evolutionary history of plants. So we really see a connection to the charophytes through the hornworts and the liverworts. And we have around here a genus called Anthoceros. I've never seen it, to be honest. Hornworts are fairly inconspicuous, small plants. You really have to be looking for them in order to find them, from what I've been told. But they are out there. So they have a very green alga-like body, or thallus, to them. And then that's the gametophyte. And then the sporophyte is superficially looks like a horn. Really what it looks like is kind of like a blade of grass. But kind of like a tubular blade of grass, which gives it a horn-like appearance. And when it produces the spores, it will pop open and release the spores. And so we call that popping open dehiscence. So we say the sporophyte is dehiscent. And unlike the other bryophytes, the sporophyte is photosynthetic. It is green and can photosynthesize and feed itself. But in these gametophyte-dominant plants, we typically find that the sporophyte does not photosynthesize on its own. So here's what a hornwort would look like if you were to come upon one. These green things that look like blades of grass in this image, those are the sporophytes, as I said. And they also someone thought they looked like horns. That's why they're called hornworts. And you can see they're growing out of what looks like a patch of algae. And that is the gametophyte. The gametophytes of these hornworts. Here in isolation you can see the sporophytes growing out of the gametophyte tissue. Here that's just kind of like, looks like a bunch of kind of like chewed up lettuce or something. Not much of a body plan to their body plan. Next phylum is the Hepatophyta. These are your liverworts. They have a thallus that is a little bit more organized in appearance. It is dichotomously branching. And that means that every time it branches, you have two more or less equal-sized lobes. So think about like a tuning fork, or well, think of a tuning fork, where the two lobes of the fork are equal in size. And that's something that we see in liverworts. Liverworts are capable of reproducing asexually using a structure called a gemma, or we have gemmi, if there are many of them, produced in a little cup-like structure called a gemma cup. And we have male gamete-producing structures that are called antheridiophores. Anther, like the male parts of a flower. Antheridiophore is the container for the antheridia, the structures that actually produce the male gametes. And we have an archegoniophore, which produces or contains the female gamete-producing structures, the archegonia. They also have a sporophyte, which is dependent on the gametophyte, which is attached to that gametophyte by a structure called a foot. And the sporophyte is arranged as something like a capsule. And I'll show you a picture of a capsule in a minute here to show what that looks like. Inside the capsule is where the spores are produced, where meiosis occurs. And then when the spores are produced, they have structures on them called elaters. And these elaters help the spores to disperse. They catch the breeze, and they can also help the spores to find a place to anchor, or can anchor them to the ground. So these are female gametophytes of a liverwort. And here on the dichotomously branching thallus down here, you can see some gemma cups with the gemmi in them. And these things that look like little miniature palm trees, these are the female gametophytes. These are the archegoniophores. And the archegonia, or the female gamete-producing structures, are found underneath these lobes. So here's more female gametophytes. And here you see the antheridiophores, or the male gamete-producing structures. They kind of look like serving trays, or maybe a little bit like